Old black man with a sack claims bank ownership. They laughed until they regretted it. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. As the heavy doors of Chase Bank swung open, a hush fell over the crowd inside. An old man, his tattered coat hanging loosely from his frail frame, shuffled into the bank. His shoes were worn thin, the soles fraying with each slow, deliberate step. His hair, a wild mess of tangled silver curls, framed a face etched with the harshness of time and struggle. The scent of dust and age clung to him, a stark contrast to the sleek, polished interior of the bank. He carried a frayed canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The fabric faded and worn, yet it seemed heavy with secrets long buried. The people inside couldn't help but stare, their whispers starting as low murmurs, quickly building into mocking laughter. A middle-aged woman, sharply dressed in expensive clothing, instinctively pulled her purse closer, her eyes darting nervously as if the presence of the old man somehow threatened her comfort. Two young bank tellers snickered quietly, exchanging looks filled with condescension. Probably wandered in by mistake, one of them muttered, eyes flicking over the old man with a sneer. But Elijah Carter, the old man, showed no sign of noticing the mocking gazes or the soft laughter that rippled through the room. He walked with a quiet, unwavering determination, his eyes scanning the lobby, not with fear, but with a sense of purpose that seemed to only grow stronger with each step. As he reached the center of the room, the mockery intensified, yet Elijah remained unfazed. His voice, low yet clear, broke the suffocating silence that had fallen around him. "This bank is mine," he declared, his words simple but laced with the weight of history. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The laughter that had echoed through the space suddenly ceased, replaced by a stunned silence. It was as if the entire lobby was holding its breath, unsure of how to respond. Some customers exchanged glances, unsure whether to dismiss him as a crazy old man or to look for the hidden truth behind his bold statement. As Elijah stood in the heart of the Chase Bank lobby, the mocking laughter from the crowd lingered in the air, yet there was a stillness in his presence that seemed to command attention. He wasn't a frail old man lost in a delusion. His eyes, dark and unyielding, spoke of years spent fighting battles not easily won. The bank's patrons, once comfortable in their well-ordered lives, began to sense that something was amiss. The tall, muscular figure of the security guard, Stephen Harris, stepped forward, his uniform sharp and his expression hard. He towered over Elijah, an embodiment of authority. His eyes narrowed in a mixture of suspicion and disdain. With each heavy step, the crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. "Hey!" Stephen's voice was harsh, cutting through the thick silence that had fallen over the bank. "This isn't a place for you to be wandering in and causing trouble." His tone was full of condescension, as though dismissing Elijah's very existence. "You'd better leave before I make you." But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't step back or lower his gaze. He stood firm, rooted in his own quiet power, the years of hardship written deep in the lines of his face. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, only an unwavering resolve that seemed to absorb the taunts and the venomous glares. The tension in the room grew, thick and palpable. As the silence deepened, the old man's voice broke through the heavy air once more, clear and steady, filled with quiet authority that made every word seem like a declaration of war. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elijah replied, his words slow but steady, rippling through the frozen atmosphere. "I'm here to take back what's mine, something this bank took from me over 50 years ago." A murmur of confusion swept through the crowd, the earlier mockery replaced by uncertain glances. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in the eyes of those who had once viewed Elijah as nothing more than an old, confused man. Even Stephen Harris, the imposing security guard, paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing, unsure of what to make of this strange declaration. The tension in the bank reached its peak, as though the very air had thickened, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the storm Elijah had quietly promised to arrive. Elijah's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. The crowd, still stunned into silence, watched as the old man slowly, deliberately, reached down and unlatched the frayed canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. Each movement was careful, calculated, as though he were about to unveil a secret that could shift the very foundation of the bank around him. The whispers that had once filled the room died down to nothing as the customers and employees stood frozen, their gazes fixed on Elijah with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. With a steady hand, Elijah opened the bag, revealing its worn, faded interior. For a brief moment, the onlookers saw nothing but the crumpled fabric and the remnants of a life lived on the fringes. But then, as Elijah reached deeper into the bag, the truth began to emerge. Slowly, like a hidden treasure unearthed from the dust of forgotten years, stacks of yellowed money began to surface. One by one, the old bills, stamped with the unmistakable logo of Chase Bank, though decades out of date, began to spill onto the cold marble floor, scattered in disarray like forgotten relics. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The sight of the ancient currency sent a chill through the room, as if time itself had been cracked open and the truth was flooding in. The bills, though old and brittle, were unmistakable. Each one bore the faded mark of the very bank that had once belonged to Elijah. The old man stood motionless, watching as the evidence spilled out in front of him. The room, once full of derision, now hummed with a tense, uncomfortable silence. Some customers backed away, eyes wide with shock, while others glanced nervously at each other, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. Elijah's voice broke the silence again, quiet but steady, filled with the weight of years of pain and betrayal. "This is the money of Chase Bank," he said, lifting a bundle high for all to see. "The money that I helped build. The money that was stolen from me." The room held its breath. It was as if every person present knew they were witnessing something monumental, something that would change the way they saw the bank, and perhaps their entire world, forever. Elijah's declaration wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge, a claim to what had once been rightfully his. The power dynamics that had stood for decades were beginning to crumble. And in the midst of it all stood an old man, battered by time but unbroken, demanding what was his. The atmosphere in Chase Bank shifted, the air thick with disbelief. James Thompson, the bank manager, had been watching from behind the counter, his expression once cold and dismissive, now frozen in a mixture of confusion and unease. He had seen many disturbances in his time, but nothing like this. Nothing that could shake the very foundation of the bank he had worked his entire life to uphold. His eyes flicked nervously between the old man and the evidence now scattered across the marble floor. The old bills, the yellowed currency, the undeniable truth, it was all too much to process in one instant. For the first time, James felt the ground beneath him begin to tremble. Elijah stood tall, unwavering, the weight of years of injustice pressing down on him. Yet his posture was that of a man who had fought long and hard for this moment. He didn't flinch when James approached, trying to maintain an air of control, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. James cleared his throat, his voice a little more strained than he intended. This doesn't make sense," he said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "How do you have this money? This bank has been run by the Matthews family for decades. There's no record of you, no record of your name anywhere." Elijah's gaze remained steady, cutting through the layers of doubt that clouded James's mind. "I know what you've been told," Elijah replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime. "But the truth has been buried. This bank, your so-called Matthews legacy, was built on lies and stolen from me." James felt his confidence begin to slip. He had built his entire career on the belief that the bank was an institution of integrity, a symbol of success and stability. But now, with the weight of Elijah's words pressing down on him, it all seemed like a lie, one carefully constructed and maintained by people with power and privilege. The murmurs of disbelief spread among the crowd. The employees who had once dismissed Elijah as nothing more than an old man with a wild claim were now exchanging uneasy glances. They, too, were beginning to question everything they had known about their place in this bank. Stephen Harris, the security guard, stepped forward, his posture rigid with authority. But his usual aggressive demeanor faltered. "You're causing a scene," he muttered, his voice laced with irritation. "This is just nonsense." He reached for his gun holster, the movement swift and threatening. "I'll call the police if you don't leave now." But Elijah wasn't intimidated. His calmness only seemed to intensify the tension in the room. Slowly, he bent down, not to retreat, but to claim what was his. He reached into the bag again, his gnarled hands moving with purpose, pulling out a stack of documents, old, fragile, but undeniable. He held them up for all to see, letting the truth sink in with each passing second. The words on the pages, the signatures, the records, each one a testament to the history that had been hidden for so long. "This is the proof," Elijah said, his voice strong, cutting through the silence that had enveloped the room. "I founded this bank. I was the one who built it. And now I'm here to take it back." The air in the bank had thickened with tension, as though the very walls themselves were holding their breath. As Elijah's words settled, the murmurs of disbelief began to grow louder. But something else was shifting, too. A quiet but powerful undercurrent of solidarity was stirring among the employees. First, it was Emily Roberts, a young teller known for her quiet demeanor, who took a step forward. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes locked on the crumpled old bills that lay scattered across the floor. Then, with a steady breath, she bent down and picked up one of the faded bills. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned it over. The old Chase Bank logo barely visible, but still unmistakable. Without a word, she placed the bill gently on the table before Elijah. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it spoke volumes. A small act of rebellion, a silent declaration that she, too, trusted Elijah's story. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the room as other employees began to take notice. One by one, they stepped forward, their faces filled with quiet resolve. Josh Taylor, the young man who had once smirked at Elijah, now found himself lifting another worn bill from the floor. His fingers were no longer full of contempt but instead full of remorse. He placed it beside Emily's, his eyes meeting Elijah's with a mixture of guilt and newfound respect. "I trust you too, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But his words cut through the tension like a knife. The ripple grew into a wave as more employees, their faces once filled with skepticism, began to step out of the shadows of indifference. One by one, each person bent down, their hands picking up the old money with reverence. A silent chorus of support built, each action louder than words. A powerful rejection of the lies they had been complicit in. It was as though the truth Elijah carried had ignited something deep within them, a call to stand against the injustice they had long ignored. The once cold and sterile atmosphere of the bank was now charged with an energy, a sense of collective purpose. Even James Thompson, the bank manager, watched in stunned silence as his employees, once his subordinates, made their choices. The look of uncertainty that had overtaken him was now slowly being replaced with something else, something closer to admiration. His gaze flicked between the people who had chosen to side with Elijah, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he now knew he had to make. In that moment, the power Elijah had wielded in this room wasn't just about the past, it was about the present. About standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And in that very instant, the shift was complete. The bank was no longer a place of cold corporate greed, it had become a battleground for truth, for redemption, for the courage to stand against the oppressive forces that had shaped its history. Elijah, though still standing tall amidst the chaos, no longer stood alone. The fight for justice was no longer just his. It had become the fight of everyone who had witnessed his struggle and chosen to believe in the truth he had carried with him all these years. The tension in the bank reached a boiling point as Stephen Harris, the security guard, stood at the center of the storm, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His jaw was clenched, and his chest rose and fell with each breath, his body trembling with anger and frustration. He had spent his entire career maintaining order, upholding the rigid structure of authority that the bank represented. But now, standing in front of Elijah, his control was slipping. His eyes darted nervously between the old man and the employees who were slowly stepping forward to show their support. The weight of his own doubts began to crush him, but he fought it with every ounce of aggression he could muster. "Enough!" Stephen's voice cracked as he shouted, trying to regain the authority that was slipping through his fingers. "You need to leave, now. You've caused enough trouble, and I won't stand for it anymore." His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, his body posture tense, as if ready to make a move. The air around him felt thick with his anger. But there was something else now, a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation that threatened to expose the cracks in his own armor. But Elijah stood unwavering, his eyes calm yet piercing, as if the decades of hardship and injustice had built a reservoir of strength within him that no amount of intimidation could break. He did not flinch under Stephen's glare. Instead, his voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. The words deliberate and heavy with truth. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his tone steady, yet powerful. "I'm here to reclaim what is mine. The truth that you've tried to bury for decades." The room fell into a suffocating silence. No one dared to speak. The bank's once unwavering sense of order was being dismantled by the force of Elijah's calm resolve. Stephen's hand twitched at his side, his thoughts racing, but his body was frozen. For the first time in his life, he found himself facing a truth he didn't know how to handle. His authority, once unchallenged, now seemed fragile in the face of the man standing before him, Elijah. The very symbol of resistance, of dignity against the relentless march of injustice. James Thompson, who had been watching from the sidelines, could no longer ignore the shift in the room. The employees who had stood silent before were now moving, aligning themselves with Elijah. His gaze shifted from Stephen to the group of employees who were now united in their stance. Their actions speaking louder than any words could. The truth, it seemed, was no longer something to be buried, it was something to be fought for. Stephen's hand hovered over the gun, but a strange hesitation filled the space between his fingers and the cold steel of his weapon. The weight of his decision bore down on him, and for a fleeting moment, he found himself questioning everything he had believed in. The gun, once a symbol of control, now felt like an anchor pulling him deeper into a storm he couldn't control. And in that storm, Elijah remained a calm, unyielding presence, a man who had lived through a lifetime of loss, but whose spirit had never broken. Finally, the silence shattered. "Put the gun down, Stephen." James Thompson's voice rang out, shaking but resolute. The words were simple, but they held a weight that even Stephen couldn't ignore. The tension that had suffocated the room for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Stephen's hand slowly, reluctantly, fell from the gun, his eyes still burning with anger and confusion. But even as his weapon was returned to its holster, the shift in the bank was irreversible. Elijah's truth had broken through, and there was no turning back now. The room, once thick with tension, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. James Thompson, the bank manager, stood at the edge of the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been a man who thrived on control, but now, facing Elijah's unwavering certainty and the mounting pressure from his employees, he felt like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by forces he couldn't ignore. His mind raced, torn between the comfortable lies he had always believed and the undeniable truth Elijah had just laid bare. The room was filled with the uneasy shuffle of feet, the shifting of eyes from one another, each person silently grappling with the weight of the moment. For a long moment, James said nothing, his eyes flicking over the room, looking for something, anything, to cling to. But there was nothing left to hold on to. He could feel the walls of his reality crumbling. Each word Elijah spoke, each action of the employees who stepped forward in support, eroding the foundation of the life he had built. The power of the Matthews family, the legacy he had always respected, was now exposed for what it truly was, a lie. He knew that if he stood silent, if he did nothing, it would not only be the truth that would be lost, it would be his soul, his integrity, his chance at redemption. James took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the decision that loomed over him. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the silent judgment of his colleagues, the quiet pressure of Elijah's piercing gaze, waiting for him to make the right choice. And in that moment, James knew that he could no longer play the part of the compliant bank manager, hiding behind the mask of professionalism. The truth had already come to light, and there was no turning back. "I've seen the documents," James said finally, his voice shaky but gaining strength with each word. "I've read the history, and I can't deny what's in front of me anymore. The bank, everything, it's been built on lies." A murmur rippled through the employees, a quiet wave of agreement. James's voice grew stronger, fueled by the surge of courage he hadn't known he had. "I can't ignore this," he continued, his gaze shifting from Elijah to the faces of the employees who had chosen to stand with him. "We've been living in the shadows of a lie for too long. It's time to face the truth, no matter the consequences." His words cut through the tension, shifting the energy in the room. The quiet rebellion that had started with a few employees had now spread like wildfire. One by one, the rest of the employees who had been silent until now began to step forward. their eyes filled with resolve. They were no longer afraid. They were no longer willing to stand by while injustice prevailed. Elijah had sparked something in them, a call to action. A refusal to continue living in a world built on falsehoods. James knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. The Matthews family would not let this go easily. The legal battles, the public outcry, the fall of Chase Bank's empire, it would all come crashing down. But he also knew that he had made the right choice. There was no turning back now. Elijah had shown them the truth. And now, together, they would fight for it. For the first time in a long time, James felt a sense of peace. Not the peace of control, but the peace of knowing he was finally doing the right thing. And as he looked around the room at the employees who had chosen to stand with him, he realized that they weren't just fighting for Elijah's justice, they were fighting for their own redemption. For a future where truth would finally be the foundation of everything they stood for. The atmosphere in the bank shifted as Elijah's declaration lingered in the air. But the truth was far from over. As Elijah slowly bent down to pick up his old canvas bag once again, the weight of the moment seemed to press on everyone in the room. His hand, weathered by years of hardship, moved with deliberate slowness as if every second carried the weight of his long struggle. He pulled out a final bundle of faded papers, their edges brittle with age, and held them up for all to see. "These are the legal documents," he said, his voice steady but filled with the force of conviction. "They prove I never signed over ownership of this bank. This bank was stolen from me." The room fell into complete silence as Elijah's words struck like a thunderclap. Even Stephen, standing at the edge of the room, couldn't ignore the shockwave that ran through him. James, still processing the gravity of the situation, watched as the employees began to stir, their once hesitant support now emboldened by the undeniable evidence before them. One by one, the employees who had stood in silence began to step forward, placing their trust in Elijah's words. This was no longer just the story of one man reclaiming his stolen past. It was the collective acknowledgement of a long-buried truth. And in that moment, Elijah knew the tide had turned. The truth was out, and nothing could silence it now. As the silence in the bank deepened, Elijah stood still, his eyes fixed on the employees who had gathered in quiet solidarity. The weight of decades of injustice hung heavy in the air. But now, the truth had come alive. James, his hands trembling, stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "We're taking this to the board," he declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "We can't let this lie continue." The employees exchanged glances, their earlier fear replaced by a newfound courage. They had seen the truth, and now they were ready to stand by it. No matter the consequences, the Matthews family, once untouchable, would no longer be able to hide behind their lies. Elijah had ignited something in them, a fire that could no longer be extinguished. The battle for justice had only just begun. As Elijah stepped out of the bank, the sunlight hit his weathered face, softening the years of pain and struggle that had defined his life. He walked with a quiet pride, knowing the battle wasn't over. But today, for the first time in decades, he had reclaimed a piece of his dignity. Behind him, the once cold lobby of Chase Bank now stood transformed, its walls no longer just a symbol of power, but of truth and resistance. Employees who had once stood by, silent and complicit, now recognized the weight of the moment. The story of Elijah's fight, his unwavering courage, would ripple through the town, sparking a change that no one could ignore. The door closed softly behind him, but Elijah knew the world had shifted, and there was no going back. The fight for justice had only just begun.